Right. Yeah. So as I was saying, we talked about block format where all the elements of the letter are aligned at the left margin of the page, something that presents a really nice and neat, simple appearance. Your paragraphs are double spaced. We drew a distinction between that and modified block format, where the date, the signature lines, they begin at the center point of the page. Each paragraph may be indented 5 spaces. The subject line may be indented. If that is used, you have the option of double spacing or single spacing your paragraphs, depending on how long your letter is. So we understand letter format, block versus modified format, which is discussed in chapter 6, at the very beginning of chapter 6. What I want to more focus on is the summary of the business report, or a discussion of what makes an effective business report. And so that's going to be our focus tonight. This is an important skill in any kind of business communication, and most business communication classes will definitely cover it. A report arises because there is a specific issue or problem, and the report is commissioned because a decision needs to be made regarding that problem. And so essentially what happens is the author compiles this report to present his or her findings on the issue or problem, and then to make a recommendation about what course of action the organization needs to take. And so it begins with a problem, and the report is meant to address that problem, to make recommendations for a solution. In a nutshell, a good report also includes some in-depth analysis, though. As the writer of this report, you have to show your reader how your findings and interpretations should be read, what they should glean from this report. And you also need to help them to understand how you were able to draw the conclusions that you've drawn in the report. So there's a section in the report for your findings and analyses. We're going to get to that later. But in order to write the business report, you're going to have to do or follow much of the same skills we've been emphasizing since the beginning of the class. Clarity and conciseness, of course, are important. You want to adopt an audience-centered approach as you're compiling your ideas. If you reference any sources, you want to appropriately document those sources as you're pulling the report together. And as I said, we're going to look at APA documentation before the end of the lesson, but let's focus on a step-by-step discussion of the report writing process. Any writing activity, any writing task begins with planning. Planning is a key stage of the writing process. So as you're planning your report, you need to ask yourself some questions. The first thing, of course, is you're going to need to know what the purpose is. And if this report has an audience-centered approach, then you need to think about, as you are planning it, you need to think about who that sorry, who that audience is. Excuse me. Okay, let's give it a minute. Maybe that's my voice saying you're talking too fast. Anyway, you need to think about who is going to be reading your report, and then what is the main message that you want to convey, and what structure will best help you to convey that message. And we have several structures or several approaches that we're going to look at. But first, let's look at each step of the planning process, from knowing the purpose to your audience, to your main message, to the best structure, each part of the planning process. So as I said earlier, a report is usually commissioned because a decision needs to be made about a problem. And so as you're thinking about the purpose of your report, which is step 1 of the planning, you need to have a clear understanding of what decision needs to be made and how your report is supposed to impact that decision. So let's say you've been asked to write a report about the company sales in the first quarter of this year, first quarter of 2021. In that business case, or in that scenario, you ask yourself, after reading my report, what do I expect my readers to know? And the obvious answer to that is if this is a report about company sales, then they should know whether sales have increased or decreased in the first quarter and by how much. And they should also get some recommendations about what should be done about this loss, if there is such a loss, right? Or how to sustain the increase or even increase the increase. That may sound redundant, but how to improve on what seem to already be good sales. There's going to be some point in this report where you offer recommendations and action steps for your audience. So that is the first step, knowing the purpose, thinking about what your reader needs to know at the end of this report and what action you want them to take. The next step of planning is that audience-centered approach. So who is the main audience for your report? And who might be the secondary audience as well? So in the scenario I just used about the sales report, the commission of a sales report documenting sales for the first quarter of 2021 in an organization, who do you think might be the eyes that get to look at that report, or the audience, the readers that receive that material? Who would be the primary audience or main audience in a report like that? The store manager. Well, yes, sales managers, right? Depending on the organization, that manager may wear different hats. You may have a general manager who is responsible for many different functions, or you may have very specific division of tasks. So maybe sales managers at various branches on the island or on family islands, if that is the business structure. Who else would want to know about finance? I gave the answer. Who else would want to know about sales? It would be the finance department, right? Or the finance team, because they're responsible for allocation of resources, right? So if you have your audience members in mind, you think about what your audience already knows. In the case of sales managers, they already understand the company's sales. That's their direct area of responsibility. They may not have as detailed information as your report will provide, but they will have an understanding of how the company has been performing, and so will finance. The finance team already knows whether profits are up or down because their job is revenue management. And so think about how your report will add to or better enable them to use this information to perform their task or functions. So that's the second step, knowing your audience and how they're expected to use this information. As you're planning, you also need to think about the third step, the report's main message. So what is the primary message that you need to convey, and what are the essential pieces of information that this report should include? And the fourth step is how best to structure this report. You have two options in terms of structure or organization. The first is a kind of direct approach. So the direct approach presents conclusions or recommendations at the beginning of the report. The body of the report then follows the recommendations, and the body provides a kind of rationale for those recommendations, a justification for the recommendations made in the report. The report that we look at later in the lesson will follow this direct approach. And it's a more modern approach, and it becomes a little bit more palatable for the reader to digest the recommendations made. If the recommendations are unpopular or controversial, let's say the report recommends downsizing or some equally unfavorable management strategy or cost-saving strategy, then you might use what we call an indirect approach, which puts the reader in a position where they get the discussion first, and then you get conclusions and recommendations at the end of the report. So there's a kind of delay before the bad news or the what some may seem to be stringent measures come at the end of the report, the stringent recommendations. Because this is a writing activity, it would be good writing practice to, of course, draft an outline of your report. And as you're drafting, think about organization and flow. Think about the purpose, make sure it meets the needs, it meets the specifications of your target audience, and it has all the relevant information. So you're kind of checking, you're kind of doing like a check back to make sure in your draft, and it's just a draft, it's just an outline. In your outline, you are hitting all the key points and the targeted areas necessary for this report. And from that draft, that outline, you could begin putting your report together. Now, the key parts of this report, any business report, will be, of course, the cover letter or memorandum. You're going to need a title page. You're going to need an executive summary. You're going to need a table of contents. You will include an introduction, conclusions, and recommendations. And we'll talk about why you have both of them in this report. Findings and discussion, a list of references, and any appendices that you include. So I'll repeat the key parts again. So there's a cover letter or memorandum, depending on whether this is internal or external. Title page, you need an executive summary, a table of contents, you need an introduction, conclusions and recommendations, findings and discussion, a list of references, and appendices. These are all key parts of your report. So I said that you need a cover letter or memorandum. So let's look at each component of this report in detail. What would determine whether you include a cover letter, for instance, versus a memorandum? What do you think the answer to that is? When do you make the choice about including, or what determines the choice? Is it going to be a cover letter that goes at the beginning of this report or a memorandum? When do you use a cover letter? You use a cover letter, which is more formal, when the recipient or recipients of the report are outside the organization. Then a letter format is more appropriate. If the recipients are inside, then you generally use a memo for internal communication anyway. A memo is more appropriate, right? So what does the cover letter include? This is different from the cover letter that you submit along with your resume. We're gonna talk about that in a later lesson, but the cover letter for this report or memorandum should remind the audience or the reader about their request for this report. You need to state the purpose of the report, acknowledge any help or assistance that you received in compiling this report, and indicate any future actions that need to be taken. So that's the purpose of the cover letter or memorandum. It is used to introduce the report to the reader. The title page, which comes after the cover letter or memorandum, is pretty standard. You have date of completion or submission, a description of the project, the author's names, and their organization. Or there's one author, the author's name and his or her organization. Now, the executive summary, some people like to think of this as a kind of abstract, but it's different from an abstract because it takes an attitude. And I don't mean attitude in that you pick up some negative vibes. No, it takes an attitude in that it makes recommendations and suggestions. So the executive summary, which comes after the title page, functions to help the reader to quickly grasp the report's purpose. So you should be able to look at the executive summary and in a glance, understand the key components and the purpose of this report. So your executive summary isn't going to be very long. It shouldn't be longer than a page, but it should help the reader to understand the report's purpose, conclusions, and key recommendations. After you have your executive summary, and as I said, we're going to look at a sample to see if it touches on all of these points that we're going over. But after the executive summary, you have the table of contents, and we've all seen a table of contents before. All right, it includes page numbers, each aspect of the report, or section of the report is listed and the page number, as well as headings and subheadings. When we look at the sample, we'll see just how these subheadings and headings are indicated and the kinds of font used and the things that we do to draw attention to various parts of the report. The introduction, which is the fifth part of your report, is like an introduction in an essay, meant to orient your reader to the purpose of the report. So because it's a kind of orientation, you need to describe the context, you need to describe the situation, the subject matter, the issue that's being reported on, the scope of this report. How far is this investigation going to go? You may give a preview of the structure of the report and also comment on any limitations. So what will this report not cover? What assumptions does the report make, but what limitations does the report possess as well? And you may think it sounds redundant, but the sixth part of this report allows for conclusions and recommendations. The difference between the two, though, relate to time. The difference between conclusions and recommendations relate to time. So when you're writing conclusions, you interpret and summarize the findings and you say what they mean. So the conclusions in the report relate the issue or the problem using the data presented. It doesn't introduce any kind of new material. The conclusions may be numbered, but they're given in a kind of parallel form. So one conclusion drawn is not presented in a way that it seems more weighty than the next or more important than the next. And then at this stage where conclusions are drawn, you are objective. You're not manipulating the data. You're simply presenting information, presenting findings. The recommendations, on the other hand, are focused on the future. So where conclusions relate to the past or present situation, the recommendations look forward. So there should be very specific, action-oriented suggestions to solve the problem in the recommendation section of the report. These suggestions or actions avoid conditions. So there are no maybes and perhaps. Each suggestion is presented in an action-oriented way. What does that mean? That means you begin with a verb. The recommendation is to do X. The language is very direct. The recommendations are also numbered so that they're easy to identify. And if you're asked to describe, you describe how the recommendation should be implemented, but that's only if you're asked to cover this in the scope of your report, right? You don't necessarily have to make action strategies or implementation strategies that may be beyond the scope of your report. But each report is different depending on the objectives and the directives you've been given. Unlike the conclusions, the recommendations are arranged in a way that moves from most important to least important. So they're not parallel. Most important recommendation first, least important recommendation last. And the key thing to remember is that although the conclusions and recommendations come before your discussion, because the discussion is part 7, so the conclusions and recommendations come before. Remember, we're using a direct approach. They need to logically flow from the discussion. So when your reader gets to the discussion part of this report, they need to see in the discussion where there is support for the recommendations or justification for the recommendations that you've made. And so the discussion is the main part of your report where you present your findings and you do your analysis, you give your information, you provide your evidence and your conclusions. And so that is the connection between the recommendations and the discussion. The discussion should follow logically. So I shouldn't see, or anyone reading your report shouldn't see you recommending something or a course of action that the discussion doesn't support or warrant, right? There should be a logical flow between the two. And then when you're using information from outside sources, sometimes you do research, you draw on other findings, you may draw on business cases, you may draw on whatever precedent has been set for whatever recommendations you're making. You reference outside sources, and that's where the APA documentation that we're going to discuss in a little bit comes in. And then appendices. So you include appendices when there is supplementary material that provides more clarity for the reader. If you want to include appendices, you have the option of naming them Appendix A or Appendix 1. You can use numbers or letters, but make sure that in your text, you refer clearly to those appendices, right? When you include information in the appendices, you need clear notes that refer your audience members to the relevant section, right? Okay, so that was a mouthful and a whole lot. I want us to look at a sample report that pulls it together. We're going to study it to see in practical terms these parts that I've identified, and I'm going to share my screen with you so that you get a visual of what a business report looks like. Let me go back up. I want to make this bigger as well. Let's see if I'm able to do it. Control plus. Because this is a PDF, here we go. Let's see how big I can make this. Okay. More center. All right, so we have a memorandum in this sample report. And based on this memorandum, we can determine what about the report that follows. Is this going to be internal or external?
Internal.
It's going to be for internal recipients, right? And so this memorandum or the instance of this report is explained. What was it that generated, or what is the purpose for this report? All right, I'm going to give you a minute to read it. I may have to minimize it just a little so that the entire memo is visible. And also pay attention to how the document is set up. So based on the memo that you just read, what is the purpose of this report? What initiated this report? What problem needs to be solved? Can you hear me? I feel like I lost the class.
The use of the recycle or the participation or the awareness of the recycling program.
So how do we get, thank you, Janice. Yes, how do we get more people to make use of the college's recycling program? And then you see the second paragraph of the body indicates any future actions that need to be taken. And the memo concludes by giving acknowledgement to the persons who assisted in compiling this report. So that's page 1. From that page, you have cover page. So you have the recipient or the reader, and you have the names of the people who prepared it and the date. This isn't given a page number, and that's pretty standard. When we get to the next page of the report, the executive summary, you will see that Roman numerals are used at the bottom of the executive summary. And the executive summary, as we said, briefly outlines and describes the purpose of the report. Again, and the kinds of research, the conclusions that the report draws. And so it gives a summary of the report at a glance. Any recommendations made? Now, the executive summary isn't, we don't use Arabic numbers for the executive summary. The table of content follows the same rule. We use Roman numerals, but every other page would use the Arabic numerals. So numbers 1, 2, and 3, as opposed to the Roman numerals you see. As we go through, we have a table of contents. And it's well put together. On the table of contents, what do you note about the font? What do you note about the kinds of decisions made to make the information stand out? Let's say I am, the name of this lady, I am Cheryl Bryant. And I've reviewed this report, and 1 week later, I want to go back to a particular section of the report. What do they do, the compilers of this report? What do they do to make it very easy for me to find the section that I'm looking for?
They'll use a bold font.
So you see some portions of this text are in bold, large font. You have major parts and then subparts or subheadings, which are not in bold font, but you have clear page numbers as well, right? So where do you find the exact parts of the report that may interest you?
Well, number 3 is highlighted in red. They are the recommendations. So I'm assuming that's the main part of the
And it's
report.
underlined, yeah.
Right.
And so if I were Cheryl Bryant and quite busy, I might skip straight to the recommendation on page 5, right? If we go down to the introduction, you see the context for the report. This APA referencing style, we're going to talk about it now, but we're not going to get to the references page just yet. But because the report illustrates APA in-text citations, I'm going to talk to you about what in-text citations are and what documentation and responsible use of source information involves. And it's an issue that, well, I haven't had that issue with this class, of course, because we haven't had to do any research and documentation assignments, but it is a persistent problem in academia where students tend to feel as though they can consult a source or do more than consult a source, directly borrow from or take information from an outside source and not acknowledge the source of the information. Some students also feel that if they put the words from the original into their own words, if they do a kind of summary, which we've learned to do over the last few weeks, but if they do a kind of summary of the original, that summary in some way becomes their own idea, conveys their voice or their attitude, and so it no longer has to be attributed to a source. All of that is actually flawed information, and it's something that as a department at UB we battle with constantly. I spend a lot of time talking to my students about research and documentation and learning about APA, which is the most common form of referencing used in School of Business. But as I said, I'm a professor in School of English in the humanities. And so there is a different style of documentation. We use MLA documentation. Chicago style is another form of documentation. Harvard has developed its own style of documentation called Harvard style. There are many different forms of documentation to choose from. APA is the most relevant, given the subject of this course. And so there are 2 steps for documenting any source used. Step 1 involves these parenthetical notes that you see in the body or on the screen in the introduction. So when you see Kahan in parentheses and 2008, and Holusha and 2010 in parentheses, and Schneider in 2009, and DeBlanc in 2009, Jodine, those little bits of information all mean something. That means that for instance, if we look at the Kahan example at the top, it means that this first sentence is taken from Kahan's source, which was published in the year 2008. Because I have not enclosed this in quotation marks, it tells the reader, this is not a direct quote from Kahan, but I've borrowed the idea from Kahan, whose source was published in 2008. When you use a direct quote, you do what this line illustrates. You enclose the quoted material in quotation marks. This is not enough information, though, these parenthetical notes. There's a second step to APA documentation, which we'll look at in more detail, but that second step is the references page, which gives complete bibliographic information about Kahan and Holusha and Joldi and DeBlanc, these sources used in this text. What is complete bibliographic information? Well, we need more than the name and year of publication if we're going to find the source. And that's essentially the purpose of documenting sources, right? We want to responsibly use the source and provide all the information necessary so that if someone coming behind us wants to find my source, they want to find Kahan or Holusha, for instance, they have what is necessary to go to the internet or to the library and find the information themselves. Okay, so that's the purpose of documentation. No matter the style used, the purpose is to responsibly credit, appropriately credit the originator of the idea, the originator of the direct quote, the originator of the information, no matter how you use it. If it's not your idea or not your words, you need to cite the source. Okay, so that's step 1, these in-text citations that you see. And we come to the introduction of this report. I'm going to give you some time just to glance over the content. We've kind of been looking at the technical side of it. Notice the numbers and the headings. And headings and subheadings need to be effectively used throughout this report. And they need to match the content, which follows, right? And we just said you use certain formatting to draw your reader's attention. So sometimes the font size may be smaller or larger in bold. You want to differentiate between headings and subheadings through making choices with font size. So I'm going to move to page 2. So we move now to Arabic numbers. So we're on page 1. Notice the way the information is organized, 1.1, 1.2. Do you see how the report is broken down into very short subheadings and short paragraphs? The language of the report needs to be very direct and easy to understand. And the information needs to be arranged logically. So you don't want your audience sifting through to find particular information. It needs to be a very user-friendly, reader-friendly document. And each paragraph should be logically organized. You want to think about topic sentences and transitions so that the ideas flow in the paragraphs. And as you're writing this report, drafting, you want to proofread, right? The language needs to be simple and the style professional. That relates to tone. You want to sound not harsh, not too personal. Your language is more formal, but a part of that professional image that you want to project is also in the grammar and the mechanics, which I said before, right? The kinds of grammar and mechanical errors that may slip through will represent the person's compiling the report poorly. And so you may need to give it several reviews before you say, okay, this thing is final and could be sent on. But pay attention to the kinds of strategies used to make the information more user-friendly. In addition to the subheadings, we also have the bulleted points and lists. If this were an essay, that would be discouraged, right? An essay is organized into paragraphs, strictly paragraphs. And because so much of an essay relies on explanation and elaboration, bulleted points and numbered lists don't really gel with that purpose. But this report is different, all right? The purpose of the document is different. It's to convey information. The setting is different in a business environment, and the emphasis is always on readability and time, saving time. Another thing that you're going to see on page 3 is the first figure, the first kind of visual. So footnotes and tables and figures and appendices, if they are used, need to be used appropriately. So if you have footnotes, they need to be used sparingly. Anything that's important to the report should be included in the report. So you shouldn't have a ton of footnotes. Anything that is represented in a table or a figure should be inserted in the text of the document, but it needs to be close to the discussion. You need to have the context, right? So right above this, we have figure 1 shows the percentage of students, faculty, staff, and administrators who participated in the survey. This is only useful if right after that description, we have the actual figure and we can compare the information. So, right? This is visually appealing. This could well have been represented in written form, but to increase the readability and appeal of this document, this figure is used, right? Representing the various percentages and the compositions of those using who was surveyed for this document. And we have a note at the bottom of the page. Remember, you use those sparingly. And now we come to the conclusion. So remember, these are parallel, right? Number 1 is not most important. Number 5 is not least important. They're numbered again. The sentences are short. Long sentences might be very, very difficult to understand, right? Convoluted syntax and sentence structure. You want to avoid that as much as possible. And that is followed up by the recommendations. Now, these are in an announced format, which means they move from most important to least important, unlike the recommendations. And remember, we talked about the action words. So increase and enhance and add and recruit and develop. Each recommendation begins with an action, something that needs to be done. And then we're going to scroll down, more footnotes. And then we come to the findings and the discussion section. I'm going to give you a minute just to see how the information is oriented. This is the section where the report findings and discussions, the analysis of the information is included. And again, we're using a sort of reader-friendly format. We have a second figure organized as a kind of table. And more visuals. Okay, so I hope that you get the point of or the basics of putting a business report together. Don't fear and think that this is something that I am at some point going to ask you to do, or that this is going to be an assignment that you have to complete or part of the final exam. You may be asked information about putting the report together, but you will not necessarily have to put an entire business report together. That would be a whole lot of work, all right, and beyond the scope and time that we have in this class. And now we come to the references page. So remember what I said about those parenthetical notes that we looked at all the way up here? Let me find one without going all the way back to the beginning of the document. I guess we do have to go back to the beginning of the document. So these parenthetical notes. So Steelman, Desmond, and Johnson, for instance, is one. That was step one. When we get to section 5, after the recommendations and the findings and the discussions, we have step 2, which is the references page. So the names that were referenced in the document or in the text of the report, you should see represented in alphabetical order on this page. I want you to take a moment to look at this references page and tell me some of the things that you identify in terms of style, setup, information included. What do you know?
I know that they put the actual page.
Well, for some sources, if you notice, I'm sorry?
I said I noticed they have the page numbers where they cited the source.
Yes, for some.
Yeah, for some.
Some sources, right? Now, this is actually, and because this is a PDF, I could not correct this, but what you should do in citing your sources when your entry is longer than one line, line 2 actually needs to be indented 5 spaces. That's what we call a hanging indent, right? So any line after line 1 would be indented 5 spaces. You include the page number for some types of sources, but not all. For instance, online sources have no page numbers. Oh goodness, I knew that was gonna happen. I'm sorry, I clicked the link, so it took me to the text. Online, I'm gonna try to avoid doing that. Online sources have no page numbers, so naturally there is no page number included in the text of the essay. That is the body of the report. If you've directly quoted from, use the source's exact words, then you use page numbers as well in the body of the report. Only in the instance of direct quotes. On this references page, you include the direct quote, the page number, sorry, for print sources, print newspaper sources. What else do you notice? Print periodicals, I should say, because the newspaper at the bottom, the magazine at the bottom, sorry, Business Week at the top, and the New York Times newspaper at the bottom, illustrates the difference between a newspaper, the New York Times, and Business Week at the top, right? In terms of documentation. They both are periodicals, so they include page numbers. When documenting a source, you also don't include the full name of the writer. You include last name and the first initial. And you should also note that these entries are in alphabetical order. So essentially, someone who wants to find Kahan's source should be able to find this issue of Business Week published on this day and in this year, and this article, and see the information taken from Kahan on page 116. Do you see how I was moving my cursor around and I accidentally clicked the New York Times and it took me to the source? That's what these references do. They should be able to take your reader directly to the source from which you took the information. But of course, that only works if it's an online source. A print source, you'd have to actually go to the library and find, right? You also credit the publisher. So for the last source, you include place of publication, New York, and name of publisher. That is because this is a book. This is the method for documenting a book. Each kind of source has a different model or follows a different format. So periodicals, like the Kahan source and the Schneider source and the DeBlanc source, are quite similar. They are all periodicals. They follow the same format. Online sources, like the Halusha source, includes a URL and a retrieval date. Because information online is updated so often, you include the retrieval date in case that information changes after you've taken the information from the source. And the Jodine source is how you would cite a source that has both an author and an editor. This is an indirect source. So this Jodine text can be found in J. Davis's Spirit of the World. This is an article, The Environment and Canada's Future is an article written by Jodine, which the persons compiling this report found in J. Davis's The Spirit of the World. So that's how you cite or document an author in an edited book or an indirect source. Okay, and so that's some pretty technical information. about documentation. Remember, there are 2 steps. The very short parenthetical notes in the body that point to the longer bibliographic entries on this references page. And then we come to the appendix. And we get an indication of how this is set up. So this is the survey that participants completed and that was used to compile the report. And it continues the page numbering. And that is the end of this sample report. It ends with the appendices. Okay. Any questions?
No, no, ma'am.